The red pulse was faint. It was a rhythmic throb buried deep within the grease-stained canvas of the duffel bag. In the pre-dawn gloom of Fort Laramie, it looked like a beating heart. Wraith didn't look down at it. She kept her eyes locked on the asphalt, her boots rhythmic and quiet against the grit. Above her, the southern boundary fence groaned. A mile-long stretch of chain link vibrated in a wind that tasted of sagebrush and JP7 jet fuel. The air was a freezing, industrial soup, thick with the scent of high-performance kerosene. She wasn't supposed to be here, according to the Department of Defense's primary server. The woman walking toward the lights had been dead for a decade. The floodlights hit her with a violent, surgical whiteness. From the security nest, she was nothing but a smudge of gray grime, a nuisance wandering into a restricted zone. The guards didn't see a threat. They saw a drifter. They saw the faded surplus jacket and the frayed hem of her trousers. They missed the heavy, exhausted slouch of someone who had walked halfway across the Mojave. They didn't notice the way her head remained perfectly level as the cameras tracked her. To Private Kelman, she was just another piece of desert trash to be swept away before the morning briefing. Hold it right there. You're a long way from the nursing home. Grandma, Kelman's voice was a jagged edge of boredom. He stepped out of the booth, the cold air snapping at his heels. He didn't ask for a permit. He simply snagged the strap of the duffel and yanked it off her shoulder with a sharp tug. He hauled the bag onto the steel inspection table. It echoed off the concrete barriers like a gunshot. "Let's see what you're hauling." Kelman ripped the zipper open and upended the bag. It was a calculated strike at her dignity. A plastic toothbrush with yellowed bristles bounced off the steel. A half-empty pack of cinnamon gum slid toward the edge. It was followed by a tattered leather notebook held together by a single, rusted binding ring. Kelman laughed, poking at the notebook with a gloved finger. A regular collector of junk, Wraith, stood motionless. She didn't flinch at the insult. Her gaze was fixed on the black orb of the security camera. Her eyes were cold and unblinking. Her stillness was unnatural. It was a heavy silence that made Corporal Mathis, the older guard, lean forward with a sharp prickle of unease. Kelman's laughter died when his hand touched the bottom of the bag. He expected more rags. Instead, his fingers closed around cold, heavy iridium. He pulled the object out, his brow furrowing. It was an old pattern dosimeter, the kind used by deep sector technicians. The casing was pitted and scarred by exposure to things that didn't have names. And there, in the center, the LED was throbbing. It was a violent, urgent red that stained Kelman's palm like blood. It wasn't just a light, it was an alarm. "What is this?" Kelman muttered. His arrogance evaporated. He flipped the device over, and his breath hitched. Laser etched into the backplate, nearly worn away but still chillingly clear, was the code, X77 Blackbird RTB. He had seen that sequence once, in a manual he wasn't cleared to read. It was a jurisdictional override that bypassed every officer on the base. The red pulse quickened. It was a digital heartbeat indicating that the woman had recently walked through a radiation field. Kelman's hand began to shake. The shift in the air was physical. Kelman dropped the dosimeter as if it had turned white hot. It slid across the steel table, coming to rest next to the dirty toothbrush. Corporal Mathis was out of the booth in a second, his face the color of ash. He didn't reach for his weapon. He stepped back, his hand hovering over his belt in a terrified reflex. He knew that stopping a carrier of that code was a violation of a directive that superseded the chain of command. This wasn't a drifter. It was a legal catastrophe in a faded jacket. The base siren didn't wail. Instead, the high-pitched keening of the fence was cut by a low, rhythmic ping, the sound of a silent lockdown. The yellow caution lights flickered and died. They were replaced by the deep, haunting blue of an oceanic emergency. The massive hydraulic rams of the inner gate began to groan, sealing the facility from the inside out. Kelman stood frozen, cold sweat beading on his upper lip. Neither man spoke. The power dynamic had been obliterated. Wraith looked at them one last time, her face unreadable, and waited for the gates to swing wide. The identification room was a pressurized box of fluorescent white and recycled air. Wraith sat on a bolted-down steel stool. Her hands rested flat on the cold laminate of the desk. To her left, the canvas duffel bag sat like an open wound. The air here didn't smell like jet fuel. It smelled of ozone and the sterile, electric sweat of terrified clerks. Sergeant Miller avoided her gaze as he pressed her finger onto the biometric scanner. A thin blue line of light swept upward, humming with digital precision. The screen didn't display her name. It didn't show her rank. Instead, the entire console flashed a harsh, warning crimson. The text erupted in block capitals: Alert, subject deceased. Eyes only. Level 7 clearance required. Miller froze. The system's cooling fans surged into a high-pitched whine. The terminal began a rapid-fire sequence of security pings. Wraith didn't move. She observed the screen with a detached interest, as if she were reading a weather report. She wasn't a person to the system anymore. She was a glitch in the afterlife. The heavy, reinforced door hissed open. Commander Hanley stepped into the room. His flight suit wrinkled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the last audit. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at the pager sitting on the evidence tray. His eyes moved to Wraith, lingering on her faded jacket. There was no recognition, only the heavy weight of a man realizing his pension was now at risk. Hanley didn't ask for her name. He knew that the moment he uttered it, he would be acknowledging a liability that the legal hold on her file was designed to bury. He leaned over the console, his shadow falling across Wraith's hands. Miller, leave the room. Take the guards. Now, he commanded. His voice was a low gravel. The younger men scrambled to obey, desperate to be anywhere but near a ghost. When the door sealed, the silence was dense. Hanley looked at the red deceased banner and let out a breath that sounded like falling glass. Wraith tilted her head toward the radar monitors in the corner. The modern arrays were sweeping the sky, but they were filled with digital snow. Your sensors are set too high. Hanley, she said. Her voice was a clipped, sandpaper rasp. Your gallium nitride hardware is looking for stealth composites. It's blind to high-density iridium. You're missing the drone because your software thinks the hardware is noise. Hanley moved to the radar bank, his fingers hovering over the controls. He adjusted the gain, his hands trembling. As the noise filtering dropped, a sharp, jagged blip appeared on the edge of the screen. It moved in a tight, mechanical arc. It wasn't a bird. It was a solid relic screaming across the coffin corner. Hanley turned back to her. The fear of protocol was being replaced by the raw adrenaline of a looming disaster. The system was failing. The only person who understood the threat was the one the system had officially erased. Hanley reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn security card. He swiped it across the terminal's override reader. He didn't call for a lawyer. He typed in a command string that shouldn't have existed in the current manual. The deceased banner vanished, replaced by a flickering gray prompt: Night Eagle protocol active. Access granted. He looked at Wraith with a mixture of profound shame and terror. There was no salute. There was only the realization that he was handing the keys to a billion-dollar facility to a woman who was officially a pile of ash. The silent lockdown continued, the blue emergency lights turning Hanley's face into a hollow mask. He stepped back, clearing a path. Wraith stood up, her movements fluid. She reached into the tray and retrieved her notebook and her pager. The power had shifted. Hanley was no longer the commander of a base, but the subordinate of a protocol. As she walked toward the door, the internal intercom emitted a low pulse. She was no longer just at the gate. She was inside the machine. The transition from the sterile, ozone-heavy air of the identification room to the cavernous depths of Hangar 7 was a physical blow. The atmosphere was a pressurized cocktail of burnt JP-7 fuel and hydraulic mist. A low-frequency hum from heavy power conduits vibrated through the floorboards. Wraith walked 3 paces behind Commander Hanley. Her boots struck the polished concrete with a rhythm that felt out of sync with the frantic activity. Above them, massive yellow gantries groaned. They shifted ton-heavy engine components through the dim air. Their shadows swept across the floor like the hands of a clock counting down to a disaster. The base had shifted into a state of pre-flight dread. It was a high-tension buzz where every airman moved with stiff-shouldered urgency. These were men who knew a storm was coming but didn't know where it would strike first. Wraith didn't look at the soldiers who stopped to watch them pass. She kept her gaze on the hardware. To her, the hangar wasn't a building. It was a living organism of metal and pressure. Her eyes caught the micro-vibrations in the fuel lines. She noticed the slight haze of heat distortion shimmering over an open maintenance hatch. She felt the base's history in the grease under her fingernails. It was a legacy of those who had built this place long before the current crew was born. Hanley led the way through a forest of F-35 airframes. Their sleek, radar-absorbent skins looked like shark hide under the sodium lights. He walked with his head down. He looked like a man trying to hide a radioactive secret in plain sight. His flight suit rustled with every heavy, anxious step. Halfway down the line, a bird was undergoing a static engine run-up. The roar of the turbofan was a physical wall of sound. It was a bone-deep vibration that rattled the fillings in her teeth. The ground crew huddled around a diagnostic terminal. They wore heavy ear defenders and neon vests. Their faces were illuminated by the frantic flickering of green and amber data streams. Wraith slowed her pace. She tilted her head. She filtered her hearing through the thunderous bass of the exhaust. Beneath the roar, there was an anomaly. It was a thin, warbling whistle that didn't belong to the Pratt & Whitney engine. It sounded like air being forced through a microscopic gap. It was the high-pitched scream of a seal, about to give way under 4,000 pounds of pressure. She didn't wait for Hanley to stop. She veered off the path. Her movement was fluid and purposeful. She ignored the startled look of a young crew chief who stepped forward to block her. High above, a red security camera swiveled to track her, its lens cold and indifferent. Wraith walked directly to the number 4 actuator housing. Her shadow stretched long across the composite wing. She reached out. Her hand hovered inches from the vibrating panel. She felt the specific frequency of the leak in her palms. It was a secondary bypass valve. This was a component that modern digital sensors often ignored until critical failure. To the crew, the engine was in the green. To Wraith, it was a ticking clock. The airmen watched her with growing irritation. Their hands tightened on their wrenches. They were unaware they stood in the presence of the woman who had written the original flight parameters for this very airframe. "Shut it down," Wraith said. Her voice wasn't loud. It carried a razor-sharp authority that sliced through the mechanical din. Sergeant Vance, the lead mechanic, stepped forward. His face was flushed with the arrogance of a man who trusted his computers more than his senses. Before he could speak, Wraith's boot shot out in a short, controlled arc. She kicked a small, glinting object across the concrete floor. It was a sheared-off titanium bolt, no larger than a thumbtack. It had been vibrating near the intake. The bolt clattered against Vance's boot with a sharp metallic ring. "That's FOD," she stated. Her gaze shifted from the bolt to the man's eyes. "Foreign object debris. You leave that on the floor, and you won't have an intake left by Mach 1. The silence that followed was heavy. It was punctuated only by the dying whine of the engine. Miller had killed the power. Vance looked from the bolt to Wraith. His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. He looked to Hanley for support. The commander was staring at the actuator panel Wraith had pointed to. "Check the bypass seal on number 4, Hanley commanded." His voice was devoid of its usual administrative fatigue. It was the voice of a man realizing a massive legal liability was unfolding. Vance scrambled to pull the panel. His movements were clumsy with sudden, sweating haste. When the seal came away, it was shredded. It was a jagged ribbon of black rubber that should have been holding back the lifeblood of the jet. The crew stood back. The outcome of her competence hit them like a physical blow. No one spoke. They avoided eye contact. There was only the chilling realization that they were being schooled by a ghost. Hanley turned away from the engine. His face was a hollow mask under the hangar lights. He didn't thank her. The shame of the institution's negligence was too thick for gratitude. He gestured toward the far end of the hangar. A massive black shroud covered a shape that defied modern aerodynamic geometry. The air here was colder. The scent of JP-7 was replaced by the dry, metallic tang of aging. "Iridium Night Eagle is in the secondary bay," Hanley muttered. His hand trembled as he swiped his level 7 card through the final reader. "It's been awake for 40 minutes. The board in DC thinks it's a software glitch. But we both know what an analog failsafe looks like once it starts its burn. The shroud didn't just cover the drone. It covered a legacy of evidence that was about to be scrubbed from existence." Wraith looked at her pager. The screen was dark. However, the casing still vibrated with the phantom echoes of the dead man's switch. She thought of Lena. Her daughter was somewhere out there in Sector 4. She was unaware that a prehistoric predator was currently calculating the most efficient way to turn her workplace into a blackened crater. The power had shifted completely. Hanley was no longer the master of this domain. He was an observer to a masterclass in survival. Wraith stepped toward the black shroud. Her stillness returned. Her mind was already calculating the wake turbulence required to ground the drone into the dirt. The mission wasn't about glory. It was about the cost of staying dead while the world burned. The war room was a subterranean cathedral of light and glass. To Wraith, it felt like a tomb of expensive delusions. Blue holographic maps bathed the technicians in a spectral glow. Their fingers danced across touchscreens in a silent, synchronized ritual. The air was thin. It tasted of recycled ozone and the sterile heat of high-end servers. On the main tactical display, Sector 4 was a vast, unblemished emerald. The radar sweeps were rhythmic and green. They reported a sky that was as empty as a desert at midnight. Commander Hanley stood before the central console. His eyes were bloodshot. He stared at a void that the world's most advanced surveillance suite refused to recognize. "The system says there's nothing there," Hanley muttered. His voice was barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. Behind him, a young ops officer adjusted his headset. His face was tight with the unearned confidence of someone who had never seen a mechanical failure. He pointed at the clean sweep. "Our noise-filtering algorithms are optimized for stealth signatures. Sir, if it's not a composite wing, the AI classifies it as environmental clutter. Birds, storm clouds, or high-altitude ice." Hanley didn't look at him. He knew the truth was far more primitive. The Night Eagle drone was a relic of analog stealth. It was a shape that modern software had been taught to ignore. The system was effectively erasing its existence by categorizing it as noise. Wraith moved to the central map table. Her boot struck the floor with a dull, heavy finality. She ignored the shimmering digital overlays. She reached out to tap a sequence into the raw data feed. With a swipe of her hand, she cleared the filters. She let the unfiltered radar returns, the messy, chaotic reality of the atmosphere, flood the screen. A jagged, flickering ghost of a signal appeared. It was barely a pixel wide. It moved with a terrifying, mechanical grace. She traced a vector with a thin finger. Her nail clicked against the glass. "It's not gone," she said. Her voice was like sandpaper on wood. "It's coasting." Here, right at 60,000 feet, the war room went still. The ops officer looked at the jagged blip. He looked back at his clean, green radar. "That's Coffin Corner," he whispered. "The margin between a stall and a structural failure up there is thinner than a razor blade. Nothing we have can stay in the air at that altitude without a computerized flight envelope protector." Hanley stepped closer to the table. The blue light of the map emphasized the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes. "He's right. We can't intercept. Our F-35s would fall out of the sky trying to match that pitch. A missile lock would never take on a cold analog engine." Wraith met his gaze. Her expression was as unyielding as a flight recorder. "I know something that does," she replied. The implication of Hangar E-17 hung in the air. It was a legacy asset from a time before the computers took over. The ops officer shifted the map view to ground-level assets near the projected impact point. The holographic terrain zoomed in on a desolate stretch of Sector 4. It highlighted a cluster of modular buildings huddled against a ridge. A small, amber icon began to pulse. "Civilian Contractor Team. Sector 4 Outpost." A personnel manifest began to scroll in a side window. It was a list of names that meant nothing to the technicians. It meant everything to the woman standing at the edge of the light. Wraith's eyes tracked the text. They hit a single name, etched in the same cold blue as the coordinates: Lena. The mission didn't just change, it disintegrated. The abstract evidence scrub and the administrative dread of Hanley's base evaporated. They were replaced by a visceral, burning pressure in her chest. Her daughter wasn't just a casualty, she was the target. The drone wasn't falling. It was being driven into the girl who thought her mother had died in the Mojave 10 years ago. Wraith's hand tightened on the edge of the glass table. Her knuckles turned bone white against the blue hologram. She didn't gasp. She didn't let out a cry. But her breathing pattern shifted. It became a slow, shallow rattle that signaled a predator shifting into a high-intensity kill cycle. The memory of a younger Lena's laughter flickered against the cold, pulsing coordinate. It was a collision of past and present that left no room for protocol. Hanley noticed the change. He saw the way she looked at the name. The stillness of her body had turned into something sharper and far more dangerous. He didn't know the connection yet, but he recognized the scent of a pilot who had found their target. Wraith turned to him. Her eyes were as cold as the vacuum of space. "Unlock Hangar E-17. Now," she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the activation of the X-77 protocol. Hanley hesitated. His hand hovered over the authorization pad. "You can't fly that bird alone, Wraith. At that altitude, without a modern life support interface, you'll stroke out before you get a visual. Your heart can't take the pressure." "Then ID," Wraith said. The words fell like lead weights into the silence of the room. "But that drone doesn't land. Not in Sector 4. She didn't wait for his approval. She turned and walked toward the heavy blast doors. Her boots struck the floor in a countdown to her own destruction. She was an analog glitch in their digital temple. She was a ghost returning to the cockpit to save the only thing that made her life as a dead person worth living. Hanley watched her go. His fatigue was replaced by a shivering realization of what he had just unleashed. The war room remained blue and silent. The cooling fans continued their indifferent hum. The woman who was already dead went to find a way to stay that way. The white pill sat on the scarred surface of Hangar E-17's briefing table. It looked small and indifferent against the backdrop of a billion-dollar legacy. Wraith didn't reach for a glass of water. She picked up the lithium carbonate tablet with 2 fingers. She felt the chalky texture against her skin. It was a chemical anchor for a body about to be pushed into the vacuum. She swallowed it dry. The metallic tang scratched her throat. It was a familiar ghost from a decade of test flight protocols. At 60,000 feet, her pulse would naturally attempt to climb into a lethal arrhythmia. She lacked the digital heartbeat stabilizers of a modern F-35. The lithium was the tax she paid to stay conscious in the coffin corner. It was a heavy, sedative weight designed to blunt her cardiovascular system. It would keep her heart from exploding under the G-load. She stood in the center of the bay. She watched the shadow of the B-2 prototype being stripped of its black shroud. The hangar didn't smell like the sterile war room. It smelled of cold, biting grease. It reminded her of an era when pilots still felt the air through the stick. Wraith checked her reflection in the polished glass of an equipment rack. She saw a woman who looked like she belonged in a soup kitchen. Her faded jacket was a stark contrast to the high-tech iridium skin of the bird. She felt the compulsion to touch the fuselage. It was a private rule she had never broken. Never fly a machine you haven't bled for. Her breathing remained shallow. She practiced a tactical conservation of oxygen. She felt the sedative begin its slow, heavy crawl through her veins. It blunted her nerves as she prepared for the sky. Outside, the pre-dawn wind carried the heavy, oily scent of JP7 fuel. It was a prehistoric sludge compared to modern kerosene. It was a high flashpoint fuel so stable you could throw a lit match into it and watch the flame drown. It required specialized heating trucks and high-pressure pumping rigs. This was a logistical nightmare that Fort Laramie had mothballed years ago. Wraith watched through the open hangar doors. The old fueling crew worked in a pressurized, frantic silence. They moved with the jerky movements of men who hadn't touched this hardware in years. Their faces were illuminated by the harsh yellow floods of the tanker truck. Every hiss of the fueling lines was an open loop in her mind. It was a constant calculation of time versus mass. Hanley stood by the pumping station. His flight suit was soaked in hydraulic mist. The crew ignored his presence. They weren't working for him. They were working for the clock. The 10-minute deadline was a physical pressure in the hangar. The air seemed to thicken. Every clank of a wrench sounded like a terminal alarm. Wraith walked toward the wing route. Her boots echoed on the concrete. She didn't offer encouragement or supervisor's ego. She simply stood there. She was an analog glitch watching a manual process. Her eyes tracked the pressure gauges with clinical focus. She knew the exact moment the JP7 reached the primary tanks. She felt the subtle shift in the vibration of the floorboards. To the crew, it was just a dangerous liquid. To her, it was the only thing hot enough to catch a rogue machine in the sky. A young fuel technician named Davis tripped over a grounding wire. He nearly knocked a pressurized valve out of alignment. He scrambled to his feet. His face was pale with a terror that had nothing to do with the explosive fuel. He looked at Wraith. His eyes searched for a reprimand or a shout. He wanted anything he could understand. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at him. She simply reached down. Her movement was fluid and devoid of wasted energy. She reset the grounding clamp with a heavy, metallic click. The silence she maintained was a weapon. There was a detached authority that made Davis back away. His hands were trembling. He didn't see a hero. He saw a liability that had been granted the keys to the kingdom. The rest of the crew followed Davis's lead. They stepped back to create a wide, respectful void around her. It was the fear of protocol in its purest form. It was the dread of standing in the way of an X-77 directive. Hanley approached her. His face was a map of administrative shame. He wanted to say something about Lena or the Outpost. However, the stillness of Wraith's face stopped the words in his throat. He realized then that she wasn't flying for him or the Air Force. She wasn't even flying for the board in D.C. She was flying for the girl on the blue map. Any social friction he introduced was just noise in her system. He handed her the old pattern flight helmet. Its visor was scratched. Its oxygen mask smelled of dry rubber and long-dead pilots. Wraith climbed the ladder. The physical toll of the lithium made her movements feel heavy but precise. As she settled into the cockpit, the smell of the cabin hit her. It was a mix of old sweat, ozone, and dry paper. She didn't look back at the hangar. She began the pre-start sequence by memory. Her fingers danced across the toggle switches with practiced muscle memory. The hangar crew began to clear the area. Their yellow vests disappeared into the pre-dawn shadows. She keyed the ground crew frequency. Her voice was a clipped, sandpaper rasp through the headset. "Clear the aft sector," she commanded. "I'm initiating a hot start. Watch the jet blast." She saw a Humvee parked too close to the exhaust corridor. Its occupants watched the hangar with wide-eyed curiosity. "Humvee on the 5 line. Move now," she stated. Her hand was already on the ignition toggle. "The JP7 exhaust will melt your tires before you put the car in gear." The vehicle lurched into motion. The driver was panicked by the sheer clinical indifference in her voice. The engines began their low, resonant growl. The air behind the bird turned into a shimmering wall of heat. It was a violent distortion that began to bake the hangar floor. Wraith didn't feel the power. She felt the weight of the mission. The drone was 4 minutes from the outpost. Her daughter was in the path of the evidence scrub. The decision was made. She kicked the throttles forward. The roar of the B-2 drowned out the bass as she began her ascent into the Coffin corner. The cockpit of the B-2 was a claustrophobic tomb of cold titanium and aging silicon. It was lit only by the sickly amber wash of the CRT monitors. Wraith ignored the modern HUD projections. They flickered weakly against the canopy like dying fireflies. She reached into the pocket of her faded jacket. She pulled out a physical data cable. It was a thick, gray RS-232 ribbon. It looked like a relic from a garage sale. Her movements were surgical. She was a ghost dancing with the machine she had helped birth. She found the diagnostic port hidden beneath a recessed panel near her knee. She jammed the connector home. There was no satisfying digital chime. There was only the heavy, mechanical thunk of hardware locking into hardware. She opened her tattered toughbook. The keys clacked with a sharp, percussive rhythm that filled the small space. On the screen, there were no icons or windows. There were no friendly interfaces. Only the raw, brutal lines of a DOS command prompt appeared. Green text bled into a black void. Wraith entered the handshake protocol. This sequence of characters hadn't been used in official logs since the late 90s. The smell of ozone began to rise from the avionics bay beneath her feet. High-voltage circuits were heating up after years of forced stasis. The cockpit air grew thick. It was pressurized by the hum of the mission computer. The machine finally recognized its mother. She wasn't hacking the system. She was waking up a predator that had been told to forget her name. The computer didn't just answer. It screamed a decade's worth of telemetry onto the screen. Columns of hexadecimal code scrolled by at a frantic pace. It was a digital waterfall reflecting in the sweat on Wraith's forehead. She ignored the noise. Her eyes tracked specific memory addresses until the scrolling stopped. A jagged, green vector graph appeared on the CRT. It represented the Night Eagle drone's current trajectory. It was a cold, mathematical certainty. Wraith, tower is screaming. Hanley's voice crackled over the radio. His tone was frayed by administrative chaos. They're demanding a flight plan. DC has a legal hold on that bird. They're threatening to scuttle the hangar if you don't power down. Wraith didn't look at the radio. She kept her gaze fixed on the vector. I'm looking at the drone's flight plan. Jim, she replied. Her voice was a clipped, sandpaper rasp. And it's not coming home. She tapped a key. She zoomed in on the terminal descent phase. The line wasn't a landing curve. It was a steep, aggressive. The drone wasn't coasting toward a stall. It was under full power. Its control surfaces were locked into a high-velocity impact profile. Hanley went silent for a heartbeat. The sound of static was the only bridge between them. A malfunction in the pitot tubes? He finally asked. He was hoping for a technical accident. Wraith's eyes narrowed as she read the final command line on the black screen. It was an order to execute scorched earth over Sector 4. The realization hit her with the cold force of a depressurized cabin. The drone wasn't broken. It was performing exactly as programmed. She traced the projected impact point on the map. Her finger hovered over the amber icon of the outpost. The Night Eagle wasn't carrying a traditional payload. Its primary weapon was the 3,000 pounds of JP-7 fuel sloshing in its wings. A high-velocity impact wouldn't just create a crater. It would generate a localized firestorm. It would vaporize biological matter and melt hard drives into slag. It wasn't a crash. It was an evidence scrub. It was a state-sponsored massacre disguised as a tragic technological failure. It was a murder. The mission had never been about recovering a lost asset. They aren't trying to save the drone. Hanley, she whispered. Her hand tightened on the throttle until her knuckles turned bone white. They're trying to burn the evidence. And Lena is sitting in the center of the blast zone. The internal shift was visceral. It was a procedural rage. A cold, silent current that ran deeper than the fuel in the wings. The conspiracy wasn't a theory anymore. It was a coordinate. The board in DC had decided that the lives in Sector 4 were an acceptable cost. Her daughter was a data point to be erased. Lena was a witness to a leak the system couldn't afford to acknowledge. Wraith's breathing turned into a slow, shallow rattle. The predator was fully awake. Her cynical eyes saw through the blue holographic lies of the base. Hanley didn't respond. The weight of the realization had stripped away his administrative defenses. On the ground, the base was still arguing over protocols. However, in the cockpit of the B-2, there was only the clock. Wraith didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for a clearance code. She reached out and flipped the engine start toggles. The airframe groaned as the auxiliary power unit surged. The sound began as a low-frequency whine. It was a ghost in the wires that quickly escalated into a bone-deep roar. The twin engines gulped down the prehistoric JP-7 sludge. The vibration was violent. It shook the CRT monitors. It rattled the heavy iridium casing of the dosimeter on her lap. Jim, get your people clear, Wraith commanded. Her voice was devoid of any human emotion. She shoved the throttles forward. She felt the massive surge of thrust as the bird strained against its chocks. The red, armed LED on the drone status line began to pulse. It was a digital heartbeat signaling that the self-destruct sequence was active. She was no longer a dead pilot in a stolen plane. She was the only glitch in a murder cycle that had been running for 40 minutes. The hangar doors began to retreat. They revealed the gray, dusty dawn of the desert. Wraith didn't look at the horizon. She looked at the green line on her screen and released the brakes. She was launching into the Coffin corner to kill a machine that was coming for her blood. The runway was a void of absolute charcoal. It was a 5-mile stretch of nothingness where the desert met the sky. Wraith didn't use the taxi lights. She didn't need the glare to tell her where the asphalt crumbled into the dust. She steered the B-2 by the bone-deep vibration of the expansion joints through the nose gear. It was a rhythmic thump-thump that matched the heavy, artificial steadiness of her own heart. The lithium had taken hold. It was a cold, gray fog that blunted her adrenaline and turned the world into technical data. Ahead, the southern horizon was punctuated by the staccato rhythm of muzzle flashes. These were distant, silent sparks where mercenaries were clearing the perimeter. They were a cleanup crew hired to ensure the asset never left the ground. A convoy of black, unlit Humvees erupted from the service road. Their tires screamed as they tore across the tarmac to intercept. Wraith observed them through the canopy with a detached, clinical focus. They didn't open fire on the airframe. The board wanted the prototype intact. Its iridium skin was worth more than the lives of everyone on the base. She felt the heavy hum of the twin engines beneath her boots. It was a predatory growl that vibrated through her marrow. To the mercenaries, she was a cornered animal in a billion-dollar cage. To Wraith, she was the only variable in an equation they hadn't yet solved. She didn't feel fear. She only felt the compulsion to finish the sequence. It was a private rule that overrode the gray sedative in her veins. The lead Humvee swerved with professional precision. Its heavy brush guard slammed into position directly in front of the B-2's nose gear. The driver was a ghost in tactical gear. His face was obscured by a ballistic mask. His posture radiated the arrogance of a man who knew the rules of engagement. He stopped the vehicle dead. He rested his hands on the steering wheel as if to say checkmate. He assumed that no pilot would risk a catastrophic collision. He believed she wouldn't shred the nose strut and scuttle the bird on the line. He relied on the procedural logic of a flight manual that Wraith had discarded decades ago. Wraith didn't touch the brakes. She didn't even slow her breath. Her eyes locked onto the Humvee. However, she consciously shifted her focus. Her mind shouted a warning against target fixation. If she looked at the obstacle too long, her hands would instinctively steer toward it. Instead, she looked at the escape vector to the left. She reached down and toggled the differential braking override. This was a manual disconnect that modern digital flight computers usually locked out for safety. She felt the heavy, mechanical clack of the main wheel locks. She wasn't preparing to stop. She was preparing to pivot. The driver in the Humvee leaned forward. His professional calm flickered as he realized the woman in the cockpit wasn't reaching for the radio to surrender. In one fluid, violent motion, Wraith slammed the left brake to its stop. She kicked the right rudder pedal hard. She jammed the throttles forward to 100% military power. This was the jagged edge of thrust just before the afterburners ignited. The airframe groaned. It was a terrifying sound of metal straining against metal as the B-2 spun on its axis. The nose gear swung wide, missing the Humvee's bumper by inches. Then, she brought the bird's exhaust nozzles directly in line with the vehicle. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a physical hammer. It was a deafening shriek that tore the desert air into ribbons. The jet blast hit the Humvee with the force of a localized hurricane. Thousands of pounds of superheated, high-velocity gas slammed into the side of the vehicle. The air turned into a shimmering wall of white heat. The windows didn't just vibrate. They shattered under the immense pressure wave. The thermal wash scorched the paint instantly as the 4-ton vehicle was lifted from the tarmac. It wasn't a fireball, but a violent rejection of physics. The Humvee was tossed aside like a discarded toy. It tumbled end over end into the dirt in a chaotic spray of sand and twisted metal. Wraith didn't look back to see the wreckage. She only felt the massive surge of power as she centered the rudders and committed to the roll. The runway was a clear, dark line stretching into the afterlife. Wraith released the left brake. The B-2 lunged forward with a violence that slammed her into the ejection seat. The G-force was a crushing, invisible weight. It pressed against her chest and forced the breath out of her lungs. The cockpit turned into a dark, vibrating tunnel lit only by the amber glow of the CRT screens. At 140 knots, she felt the lift grab the long, iridium wings. It was a physical pull that felt like the earth finally letting her go. As the nose rotated upward, a single, sharp ping echoed through the fuselage. A stray bullet from the mercenaries caught the wing root. However, the sound was already a mile behind her. She yanked the gear lever up. The mechanical whine of the hydraulics sounded like a sigh of relief. The base disappeared beneath a layer of gray dawn haze. Its floodlights and muzzle flashes turned into insignificant pinpricks of light. Wraith was no longer a drifter at a checkpoint or a ghost in a hangar. She was a rogue element in a night sky that the board's digital radar could no longer see. She checked her fuel gauges. The JP-7 sloshed in the tanks like the lifeblood of a dying god. The mission to Sector 4 had begun. The only thing colder than the air outside the canopy was the realization that she was finally back where she belonged. She was at 60,000 feet, with no protocol left to follow. The altimeter blurred. There was a spinning carousel of white digits against black plastic. 45,000 feet. The sky was no longer blue. It was a bruising, deep space violet that felt heavy against the canopy. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was thinning. The recycled oxygen tasted of dry copper and rubber. Wraith felt the pressure drop in her sinuses. A sharp, crystalline pop radiated through her jaw. Then came the familiar warmth. A trickle of blood escaped her left nostril. The metallic tang of it flooded her throat as she swallowed hard. She didn't wipe it away. Her hands were locked on the controls. Her knuckles were white. Veins stood out like whipcords beneath her skin. The old spec flight suit began its rhythmic, brutal dance. The bladders around her thighs and abdomen inflated with a sharp hiss. They squeezed her flesh to force the blood back toward her brain. It felt like being crushed by a giant's hand. Her vision began to gray at the edges. The vibrant amber of the CRT monitors narrowed into a tight, flickering tunnel. Every breath was a tactical victory. She used shallow, pressurized grunts to stay conscious as the G-load increased. The B-2 groaned around her. The airframe vibrated with a low-frequency shudder. Wraith stared through the gray haze of her vision at the vertical velocity indicator. She wasn't just flying. She was fighting the Earth for every inch of altitude. A high-pitched, staccato warning tone cut through the mechanical din. A red light erupted on the peripheral panel. Sam Locke. Sector 7, Radar. The base's automated defense network, the digital wall, had finally woken up. It didn't recognize the B-2's legacy composite skin in this profile. It saw a rogue bogey that needed to be erased. The lock indicator pulsed. It was a digital heartbeat, counting down to a missile launch. Wraith watched it with a detached, clinical stillness. She didn't evade. She didn't dump chaff. She simply waited as the system interrogated her transponder. Her pupils were dilated and fixed on the threat board. Just as the tone reached a continuous scream, the panel flickered. The red light died as abruptly as it had appeared. The digital wall's central AI had finally processed the X-77 transponder code. This was a sequence so high-level it caused a logic loop in the defensive software. The system couldn't shoot what the Department of Defense officially claimed didn't exist. The radar signature vanished from the base's monitors. It was overwritten by a subject deceased flag. Wraith took a ragged breath. Her lungs burned for air, but she forced the panic down. She didn't have the luxury of self-pity. System logic, she muttered. It can't kill what's already dead. The digital hunter had blinked. In that moment of hesitation, she was gone. 55,000 feet. The air was too thin for the modern flight computer to understand. The wings were struggling for lift. The iridium skin vibrated with the onset of a high-altitude stall. The control stick began to shake with a violent, mechanical tremor. The computer panicked. Its auto-safe mode tried to force the nose down to gain airspeed. It was an algorithmic reflex that would drop her right back into the mercenary's sights. Wraith felt the machine fighting her. The fly-by-wire system resisted her inputs with a stubborn weight. She reached for the center pedestal. Her movements were heavy and uncoordinated under the G-load. She flipped the primary guard. She slammed the fly-by-wire toggle to off manual. The amber, direct link light flashed once and stayed on. The transition was a physical shock. The stick went heavy. It turned into a dead animal in her hands. Without the computer-assisted hydraulics, she was now lifting metal with pure muscle. Every twitch of the ailerons required a gut-wrenching shove. The airframe screamed as she forced the nose back up. Her muscles screamed in sympathy. She wasn't piloting anymore. She was wrestling a titan in a vacuum. She felt the vibration of the engines through the soles of her boots. It was a primal roar that modern pilots had long since forgotten. The altimeter clicked over to 60,000 feet. Wraith leveled off. Her breath came in short hitches that misted the inside of her visor. She was now in the Coffin corner, the razor-thin margin between an aerodynamic stall and structural failure. Outside, the sky was a terrifying, absolute black. The stars were unblinking and cold. At this altitude, the gap between falling out of the sky and breaking apart was only 10 knots wide. She was balancing a billion-dollar razor on the edge of a knife. One wrong move, or one lapse in focus, would scatter the Night Eagle across the Mojave. She leaned forward. Her eyes scanned the raw radar return on the central CRT. A single green dot appeared on the edge of the sweep. It moved with a jagged, mechanical aggression. It was the drone. It was already in its terminal descent. It was a silent arrow aimed at the outpost in Sector 4. Wraith adjusted the throttle by a fraction of an inch. She felt the airframe shudder as she touched the Mach buffer. The physical toll was absolute. Her ears were ringing and her vision was a pinprick. However, she was in position. The hunt was no longer a simulation. She locked her eyes on the green dot and committed to the dive. Lena was 4 miles below. The machine coming to burn her was now officially in Wraith's crosshairs. 60,000 feet. The stars were no longer distant points of light. They were cold, unblinking eyes watching a duel in a vacuum. Wraith leaned forward. Her chest was compressed by the G-suit. Her vision narrowed to a vibrating amber CRT. The drone was finally visible to the naked eye. It was a jagged, iridium sliver. It was a prehistoric shape that modern physics had forgotten. It moved with a terrifying, mechanical indifference. Its nose was pitched down toward the Sector 4 outpost. The cockpit of the B-2 was a screaming gallery of alarms. The stall warning horn blared. It was a continuous, mournful tone, signaling that the thin air was failing to hold the massive wing. Wraith didn't silence it. The noise was the heartbeat of the Coffin corner. It was a constant reminder that she was flying on a margin thinner than a human hair. The silence of the black sky was a lie. Outside, the friction of the thin atmosphere created a high-pitched metallic shriek. It vibrated through the stick and into Wraith's marrow. She felt the heavy, sluggish response of the manual controls. It was a deadweight resistance that required every ounce of her strength to overcome. Her left ear was ringing. There was a sharp, white pain. It was followed by the warm trickle of fluid that she knew wasn't sweat. She ignored it. Her eyes were locked on the drone's flight path. She traced the invisible line that led directly to Lena. The drone wasn't just a machine. It was an executioner. It carried a cargo of superheated fuel and biological secrets. It was programmed to turn the evidence of Sector 4 into a glass-bottomed crater. Wraith, you are in the basket. Hanley's voice crackled through the headset. It was distorted by altitude and desperation. Tower has authorized the kinetic kill. Fire your missiles. Now, do it before it reaches the floor. Wraith looked at the weapon release cover. Its red paint was chipped and faded. She didn't touch it. She knew the math of the evidence scrub better than the board members in D.C. A missile strike at this altitude would cause a high-order explosion. It would aerosolize the biological contaminants in the drone's payload. It would rain them down over the entire sector. If she fired, she would be finishing the board's job for them. Lena wouldn't die in a firestorm. She would die in a plague. Negative. Hanley, she rasped. Her voice was barely a whisper against the roar of the engines. An explosion spreads the leak. I'm going for a physical intervention. The radio went dead for a heartbeat. The reality of her decision hit the war room. To the ground crew, that she was insane. She was a relic attempting a maneuver that hadn't been tested in 30 years. Wraith didn't wait for the argument. She was a pilot bound by protocol, but she was a mother fueled by a silent necessity. She felt the compulsion to finish the sequence. She adjusted the throttle. She felt the B-2 shudder as it touched the Mach buffer. The drone was 2 miles ahead. It was a dark ghost against the bruised purple of the horizon. She had 60 seconds to become an obstacle the machine couldn't predict. Wraith pushed the throttles to the stop. The roar of the JP-7 engines escalated into a bone-deep vibration. It rattled her visor. She didn't approach from the rear. She climbed instead. She forced the heavy B-2 into a precarious arch above the drone's flight path. As she crested the arc, she slammed the manual override into a hard left bank. She felt the airframe groan. It was the terrifying sound of titanium reaching its breaking point. She was creating a vortex. She was building a massive wall of high-pressure air to slam into the drone's analog surfaces. Target fixation, she whispered to herself. She forced her eyes away from the drone's wingtips. She focused on her own horizon. If she locked on, she would collide. She had to be the wake, not the hammer. The maneuver was a physical nightmare. As the B-2 rolled, the wake turbulence erupted from her wingtips. These were invisible, horizontal tornadoes of violent air. Wraith felt the sudden drop and lift. The stick fought her grip like a dying animal as the plane attempted to stall. She watched through the side canopy as the drone entered the wash. The smaller aircraft didn't just stumble. It was violently rejected. The pressure differential hit its left wing like a sledgehammer. The iridium spar snapped instantly. The drone flipped into an uncontrollable, high-speed tumble. It wasn't a computer glitch anymore. It was a mechanical failure induced by the violence of physics. The drone's engine coughed a spray of blue flame and then vanished into the dark void below. Wraith fought to level the B-2. Her muscles screamed as she wrestled the heavy stick against the negative G-load. Her vision grayed out completely for a second. It was a near miss with G-lock that left her gasping for oxygen. When her sight returned, the radar screen was empty. The green dot was gone. It was replaced by a flickering status line. The drone was in a terminal descent into an unpopulated canyon. The evidence scrub had failed. The biohazardous payload was headed for a deep, cold burial in the dirt. There would be no firestorm over Lena's head. The physical price was absolute. Wraith's nose was bleeding freely now. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to lock her elbows to maintain the flight path. The silent lockdown on the ground would eventually lift. However, the silence in the cockpit was different. It was the silence of a ghost who had successfully haunted the machine. She didn't feel the triumph of a hero. She only felt the cold, heavy weight of the lithium. She realized she was still 60,000 feet in the air with a plane she wasn't supposed to have. She looked down at the dark expanse of the Mojave. She searched for the pinprick of light that was Sector 4. Lena was safe. Her daughter was unaware that her mother had just broken the sky to save her. Wraith wiped the blood from her visor. Her expression was as unreadable as the stars. The mission was over, but the protocol of her existence was only just beginning. The return to Earth was not a triumph. It was a heavy, functional collision between a billion-dollar secret and the indifferent desert floor. Wraith didn't fight for a graceful flare. She let the B-2 slam into the concrete. The massive landing gear groaned under the weight of a mission that officially never happened. As the engines died, the sudden absence of the roar was deafening. It was replaced by the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of cooling iridium. The cockpit air felt heavy. It was stagnant with the scent of ozone and the iron tang of blood. The fluid had pooled in the base of her oxygen mask during the descent. Wraith sat in the sudden silence. Her hands hovered inches from the release buckles. They were shaking with a fine, high-frequency tremor. The simple task of unlatching her harness felt like a technical impossibility. Her left ear was a dull, throbbing void. When she finally pulled the helmet off, a smear of dark red followed the rubber seal. It painted a jagged line across the cockpit's interior glass. She was a ghost returning to a world that had already buried her. She was a relic that had outlived its own afterlife. The gray light of the overcast morning filtered through the mist. It illuminated a woman who looked less like a pilot and more like the wreckage she had just prevented. The descent down the ladder was a slow ritual of physical cost. Wraith limped across the wet tarmac. Her boots left faint, muddy prints toward the shadows of Hangar E-17. There were no cameras. There were no honor guards. There was only the cold efficiency of a system purging its own toxins. In the distance, a group of MPs escorted a man in a high-ranking flight suit. They led the vice commander into the back of an unlit black sedan. It was a quiet, bureaucratic removal. The institution was keeping the scandal within the family. Commander Hanley stood by the hangar doors. His face was a hollowed-out mask of institutional shame. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't say, "Thank you," or mention the lives saved. To do so would be to acknowledge the legality of her presence. He looked at the blood on her collar and then at the B-2 cooling behind her. "The flight logs for this airframe are being purged," Hanley said. His voice was a low, gravelly monotone that barely carried through the mist. "Maintenance will report a sensor glitch. According to the record, the Night Eagle protocol was never triggered. You were never here." Wraith gave a single, slow nod. She didn't want a pedestal. She wanted the silence to remain unbroken. Wraith turned her gaze toward the horizon. She squinted through the haze toward the distant buildings of the Sector 4 outpost. The civilian contractor teams were being loaded into evacuation choppers. Their orange vests were bright pinpricks of color against the desert gray. Through the shimmering heat distortion, she saw a young woman standing near the perimeter fence. The woman was looking up at the empty sky where the drone had vanished. It was Lena. She was alive. Her posture was a mix of confusion and a strange, lingering awe. She was safe. She would never know that the mother she mourned had just torn her own body apart to save her. The interaction was a mile of cold air and absolute silence. Wraith felt a phantom pull in her chest. For a split second, she had a visceral compulsion to walk across that tarmac and break the protocol. She wanted to tell the girl the truth. But she didn't move. She consciously tightened the public mask of the cynical drifter. To go to Lena was to bring the board down upon both of them. To stay dead was to keep her daughter safe. Wraith watched for one final heartbeat until Lena turned to board her transport. The mother-daughter axis remained an invisible line. It was a secret buried in the Mojave dust. Wraith turned away, her ears still ringing, and began the long walk back to the gate. The southern boundary gate looked exactly as it had 3 hours ago. It was a cage of razor wire and industrial dread. Wraith had traded the flight suit for her faded surplus jacket. Her shoulders hunched under the familiar weight of the old canvas duffel bag. Private Kelman was waiting by the turnstile. However, the arrogance had been bleached out of him. He didn't laugh this time. He didn't make a joke about her belongings. His hands shook as he slid her tattered notebook and toothbrush across the steel table. His eyes were fixed firmly on the ground. He knew he had touched a doomsday ghost. The fear of the protocol would haunt his shift for the rest of his career. Wraith slung the bag over her shoulder. The cold, metallic strap bit into her skin. She stepped through the gate and into the vast, gray expanse of the desert. She hadn't gone 50 yards when the pager in her pocket emitted a sharp, analog beep. She pulled it out. Her thumb brushed the worn, laser-etched casing. A single line of green text flickered on the small screen. We know you're alive. The board. Wraith looked at the message. Her expression was as unreadable as a flight recorder. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the empty lithium pack. She tossed it into the shifting sand. The wind caught the plastic, tumbling it toward the horizon. She didn't look back at the base. She just kept walking until the mist swallowed her whole.